Well, see, technical difficulties brought to you by a faculty member who still is a chalk and paper guy. Had no idea. There I was, standing in front of a mass audience, communicating nothing except the fact that I was just my mouth moving, right? Anyway, day 4, anatomy of the communication process. As we move our way through this chapter, what I'm really trying to do, to some extent, is to cause you to have to stop and think, maybe even about what other people in other classes have taught you about what the terms are that we're trying to use to understand the communication process. And in one sense, I sort of apologize for that, but I'm making a real point along the way, and that is that some of these words we can begin to take for granted, but if we do that too much, we fail to stop and examine what the terrain or the anatomy of this entity that we're studying is all about. Where do we focus? What are we looking upon? We talked about this in the first days of the semester. We go into this new town. We've never been there before. What do we focus on? What is important to us? And where we are now is the product of people that have come before us. What I want to do is to focus on the latter part of the chapter today and go through all of the elements of the communication process, as some of you may have been taught it, and bring in some other ideas as well. But before I do that, I want to make one correction in a sense of what we talked about on Tuesday. You remember I talked about 4 lines of analysis that had led us to where we were by 1960 that had sort of created the foundation for the study of the communication process. And I talked about group dynamics and interpersonal communication. And I should have put those together. That would have been one in and of itself. Although you can break that apart and see the difference between groups and interpersonal, that really should be put together. If you look on page 58, and you don't have to do it now, you can just make that as a note. The one that I left out is really important, and that's why I need to go back and talk about it. It's going to be even more important because it's the foundation for the chapter on information. It's a foundation for the discussion of systems and so forth. It's information and information theory, which in the earlier days was largely focusing on matters of transmission and reception. Our friend Shannon and Weaver. Some of us think we know what the word inform means. Wait till we get to the chapter on information and see if we really know what that means. We talk about being in the information age. Where did all of that begin? And more importantly, we get into some other terms along the way, such as cybernetics. And I'm going to talk a bit about cybernetics today. When we think about cybernetics, it is a part of our life experience where we try something and then we see the extent to which that effort produces the reward that we thought we would get by doing it. And cybernetics then becomes important to us because one of the arguments that we make about communication is that communicating is a cybernetic process. I try to tell you something, and if you don't understand it, I use that, and we'll use the word feedback, and this is a topic that we'll talk about later on today. I use that feedback to try to figure out how I might express myself differently. If I have a program that I've put on television, I may have focus groups that I use to decide whether or not people like that program or not. People periodically use focus groups and surveys to see whether the viewing public like their news formats, and they may change. So the notion of getting something back that allows us to make an assessment of whether or not what we're doing is right is a very vital part of the communication process. And in that, what we're doing is trying to acquire information that we can use then to make strategic adjustments. There's a fellow by the name of Wiener, W-E-I-N-E-R. We'll mention his name over and over again, particularly in the chapter that largely has given us the foundation for information theory and also for the principles of cybernetics. So that would be the fourth of the major influences, and we'll expand more upon that later on. But now, today, what I want to do is to sort of work our way down through the anatomy some of the words that we've got in the communication models and see whether they are satisfactory or not. So let's see if we can get our PowerPoint screen up and we'll take a look at it. What we talked about last time in terms of sender and receiver, or source and receiver. What are the implications of those two elements within the communication process and what we understand about the communication process? As it was originally used by our friend Shannon Weaver, as it was used by Berlow, it tended to feature the source as though the source was an uppercase S, really big and important, and the receiver was maybe like a lowercase r, small print, small font, relatively unimportant. The assumption is that a lot of the work was done by the source, and then the question is, to what extent can the source appropriately transmit to and or evoke the right meaning or the right response in the receiver out there. Now, we spent a lot of time thinking then of sources. We talked about source credibility. We talked about what are the characteristics of the source, et cetera, et cetera. We said the source is the primary designer of the message and so forth. And then we began to realize that receivers are pretty important. Receivers are pretty important. To what extent does the receiver influence what happens between the sender and the receiver? What do you think? Well, let me imagine this situation. Let's imagine a parent standing talking to a teenager. Some of you may remember those days. Parent talking to the teenager, and the teenager standing there silently, sullenly glaring at the parents. Is the teenager a sender? Is the teenager's sullen glare likely to influence how the source communicates? Are you listening to me? Are you paying attention to me? Any of those scripts, any that you ever heard? Last time we talked this over, you didn't pay attention, you didn't do it right, clean up your room, straighten up your life, be a responsible citizen, get a good job, pay Social Security so I can retire. These are the themes that come out of that conversation, aren't they? And the person stands there, shrugs, drifts off, rolls their eyes, and all of this kind of stuff. They are influencing what's going on. So what we realized early on is the importance of thinking about interaction. And we're going to talk about that as one of the variables up there as we go along, interaction. But at the moment, at least, the notion is that we are interested in sender and receiver. Now we get into some other kinds of problems, don't we? Particularly when we think a little bit down the line. Is a newspaper a source, or is a newspaper a channel? Can a concept be two things and be a good concept? It's not supposed to. Moreover, when we think about source for news, it's somebody other than the reporter. Is that right? The reporter talks to sources. I have my sources, et cetera, et cetera. So the source may actually be the person that was interviewed. Is that right? So in that regard, then, what's the reporter? Oh, isn't this getting confusing? And then I pick up a book and I read it, and to what extent is this a source of my knowledge, or is this a channel through which knowledge flows to me from the author? Uh-oh. We're getting bogged down already, aren't we? Thinking that we knew how we could break the communication process up, and all of a sudden we begin to see that it may not be that clear, it may not be that orderly. But that doesn't mean that at various times, in various ways, we can't make it orderly. If I'm in advertising, am I likely to think that my ad is the source, the stimulus, through which medium, print, electronic, or some other medium, And then I've got my receiver out there that's my target market. I'm not even interested in talking to everyone. I'm only interested in people who are likely to buy my product. And then my cybernetic model comes in. Did they get the message? Did they get the message as I had intended for them to get the message? Did the message achieve what it should achieve with them? Meaning, did it, what, inform them? Did it create awareness? Did it motivate them? You see, all of a sudden I can begin to bring in terminology within that situation to analyze what's going on. And if it didn't work, I can go back and redesign that message. I can put it in that particular source, etc., right? And so in certain circumstances, we can define that. We can define that. In interpersonal communication, we are probably both sender and receiver, and we often find ourselves doing that simultaneously, don't we? Simultaneously. And sometimes the message that we get back from the individual that we're communicating with can even be confusing, where we think that they're agreeing with us and liking us, but all of a sudden we're not sure. And we may then ask them in various ways or go about reducing the uncertainty of, do you like what I'm saying? Do you agree with me? Are you just going along with this? We may even use various kinds of questions to try to find out what's happening in that particular situation. To what extent, when we think about the source and the receiver, particularly the source, to what extent does the purpose that we think the source has in mind for communication influence how we interpret what the source does? Does the sense of what we think they're trying to do influence how we interpret what's going on? If we think they're lying to us, we then engage in different kind of communication behavior than if we think they're telling the truth. If they're trying to persuade us and we don't want to be persuaded, can we engage in counter-persuasion? Can we engage in resistance? Well, one of the themes that I try to get into there is to suggest that the receiver, and we talked about this early on, can be both active and passive in this process, right? Active and passive in this particular process. I think that's one of the reasons that we like the notion of interaction, which we'll talk about even further as we go along. But the notion is that interaction is important. Is interaction possible? Is interaction likely between the newspaper, the advertiser, and you, the customer? Is interaction going on there? How so? Push your button.
You can write a letter to the newspaper.
Could write a letter to the newspaper.
I think that if you buy the product, that'd be your signal.
If you buy the product. If you don't buy the product, if they try to create an event and no one shows up to the event, it means that it didn't get through, right? So there is interaction. One of the things that I find that, with the exception of Cupid, usually the shows that I like most on television don't last very long, which means that I'm probably not the right demographic. And the truth is, I'm not the right demographic. For this course, I have to force myself to watch primetime television because I'm not that demographic. Not that demographic. It's interesting in that regard as well, because one time I came home from work, I saw my daughter on the floor, and I don't know how it is that people can actually do homework on the floor. I just never quite accomplished that. Some of you are floor homework doers. She was doing calculus, watching a program on television that had rock music. I said, "What is that?" She said, "MTV." I said, "Never heard of it." Da-da-da-da-da. Now, what's more interesting is at that time I had a graduate student that worked for Coca-Cola, actually Coca-Cola Foods, and I said, "Have you ever heard of MTV?" And she said, "No." I said, "You will." Right? Because there's a demographic out there. This is a demographic that is so well defined that sweet young girls will do their calculus while watching it. So if you want to communicate with sweet young girls, you get on MTV. And do you think that Coca-Cola has figured out where MTV is? I'll bet they're on there enough so that you see those 3 impressions every day, don't you? Which in a sense means that no matter how we cut it, the receiver is often a very dynamic part of this. And when we talk about media effects later on, we'll even talk about the sovereign viewer. The sovereign viewer. To what extent does the viewer define television content? To what extent does the viewer define television content?
They sort of vote.
You bet they don't sort of vote, they really vote, don't they?
They vote by watching it or not watching it.
Clicking it. Now we guys, with the magic of the channel selector, can watch 42 channels at the same time. Particularly we can have the little window up there and then rummage around for something else. We're really good. We know that that annoys you women, but realize that we are the hunter-gatherer. We're the ones that are supposed to go out and find all of this stuff. And well, when we talk about interpersonal communication, we'll talk about power. And one of the things, and some of you already know this, right? The great fight for power within a relationship is who gets to control the remote. Because the remote, and they call it the remote control, right? But it's really a guy thing. That is our only identity in the world, is to control what channels of television we're watching and when we watch them. And my wife now has her own television because she didn't like the fact that I had recall. Well, I love recall, watching 2 things simultaneously, missing most of each of them. But it's this hunt that we just love out there. Well, see, I think that we early on, by focusing so much on the source, forgot what a dynamic role in the communication process that the receiver made. And over the last number of years, we've made a lot of adjustments in that regard. What we also have done, because the notion of source and receiver can get to be very foggy at times, is that in the literature, we've abandoned terms like that, and we use words like reader, listeners, and viewers. We may use words like customer, target markets, demographic categories. We may talk about people as interactants. When we talk about interpersonal communication, it makes no real sense to talk about sender and receiver because we're more likely to talk about interactants, or we may talk about relational partners because it's a more meaningful term capturing as a concept what's really going on, what's really important. We can talk about in public relations key publics. We can talk about partners. We can talk about all of these sorts of things which are in one way or another useful to help us to avoid buying into what was the original notion of a dominant sender and a relatively passive receiver that was being acted upon in a relatively linear way from the point of the source. And it's because we realized that we are often interactants, or that there is a receiver with a capital R and a source as a lowercase r. Well, let's talk about intent. Why do we communicate? Usually when you start communication studies, people will tell you we communicate to inform or we communicate to persuade. Is that right? And typically if you take a beginning public speaking class, we tend to sort of boil it down to inform and persuade. So is that it? Is that the only reasons why we communicate? Let's see if we can add to that. One of the kinds of communication that we find is called phatic. P-H-A-T-I-C, phatic communication. Let's imagine that you have a temperature, you have the flu, you have parked your car. Unfortunately, you didn't get your normal parking spot, which was closer to your office. You had to walk from a car at a much greater distance. It's raining that day, and coming in, you have got your clothes soaked, and you're about to give a client presentation, and one of your coworkers says, "Good morning, how are you?" What are you likely to say? "Fine, thank you." Phatic communication has nothing to do with informativeness. What's worse is we know that if we tell the other person what our day is going like at that moment, we may have created a contract, which means that we have to listen to them. When I used to teach interpersonal communication, I had people go out, and when somebody said, "How are you?" I said, "Tell them," and then see what happens. And they were supposed to keep a diary, and many people wrote saying, "Oh," when I told them, then they expected me to listen to them, and I didn't know that that was the deal. Communication can often be contracted rule-based behavior. Remember that? Contracted rule-based behavior. I think you had a hand up back there. You wanted to add one of the purposes to communication. Probably so long ago you forgot what you wanted to.
I was going to say that it can also have the intent of gathering information. Like
Gathering information. I can seek information. In dating behavior, how much of my effort is devoted to gathering information? We got Cupid to be our demonstration there, don't we? We've got 3 women, national television, gathering information. Which of these is the real genetic breadwinner? Right? The real genetic breadwinner. Doesn't it come down to this? One guy on Tuesday night was told repeatedly, "You're too young. You're not ready to get married." Are you watching it? Are you watching it? Oh, yes, you smiled. I thought one of you back there was watching. You're not. Dominique, you've been watching it, huh? Yeah, what do you think? Is Dominique, you got to push your button. Is Dominique fit?
I think he's great.
You think he's great?
But he's 21 and he's not out of school, so how's he going to provide for her?
Ah, you see, we're gathering information. Dad wanted to know, didn't he? When Dad showed up and Dominique was fixing supper, what are your intentions? How are you going to support my daughter? We're gathering information, aren't we? When I turn on the news, I'm gathering information. And sometimes it's interesting, isn't it? This goes back to the notion of sender and receiver. I don't get the information that I want, so I go somewhere else. Is that right? Are we relatively aggressive information seekers if we think the information is of value to us? When we talk about interpersonal communication later on, we'll talk about third parties. If I want to know whether somebody likes me romantically, am I likely to get one of my buddies to go and get some information for me, which I can't get for myself, and I have to create this alliance? You ask so-and-so, who will ask so-and-so, does this person like me? I got to believe that one of the reasons why teenagers don't do well in school is they spend all of their time gathering information about whether they are liked or not. Being liked is so much a part of our, oh my gosh, what did I just do? Is being liked a part of the purpose of communication? Being liked? Being liked, do I communicate with you to be liked? Be adored, be loved, be admired? Be liked. To what extent do I communicate with you to define my identity? Do I define my identity? Do I communicating with you?
I think when you're younger, you communicate to be like.
And older people don't do that, huh?
I don't think so.
Oh, wait a while. You wait a while. You don't think your grandmother and your granddad care what people think of them?
A better example would be my parents.
Oh,
Because
okay.
they were an interracial couple.
Okay.
And they didn't care what people thought about them.
And in not caring what people thought about them, did they then care what people thought about them? I think she's disagreeing. Did you get the point that I just asked? Or not? Yeah? By saying we don't care meant that even if we did care, the fact that we say we don't care means that somehow that's part of what we're interested in knowing. Yes, no? But by the same token, grandparents show up for the birthday party and they watch to see which present the children like best. Am I your favorite granddad? Every morning I watch my grandsons and granddaughters' behavior. Do you like me better than all the rest of the grandparents out there? I've got a John Deere tractor. Want to ride on my tractor? I had them loaded up. Gave it to the son-in-law. Put the boy on there, let him drive. The little girl sitting beside, there they were hauling stuff around. I'm your favorite granddad. I'm your favorite granddad. I think older people do care whether people like them or not, right? Are movies even about that? well, you wouldn't go see them because that's out of your demographic. If Robert Duvall and, now I can't think of his name, Jones, what's the other? James Earl Jones, if they are somehow kinfolks, right, is that an interest to them? You know that movie? I never saw the movie, but I knew what the theme of the movie was, that they discovered that they are genetically connected somewhere down the line. So who are we? Where do we fit into the community? Do we communicate to present our identity? When you go out there and buy your little automobile, are you in identity management, impression management? And you think old people are not out there worried what kind of a car they're driving? Does it say what we want to be said about us? First of all, we're enormously safety conscious, aren't we? We want great big cars that won't kill us. And when you're parents, you want that car for you, and then you give your children the one that's about to fall apart, knowing full well that they're inexperienced and reckless. You should do it the other way around, right? You should give them the good car, and you keep the one that's about to fall apart. You're a more experienced driver and a less reckless driver. But we don't do that, do we? And some of you are saying, I'm glad this is on tape. I want a copy. I want to take it home. I want to give it to my parents, right? So we do, in various ways, manage our impression. We look around today and see how people are dressed, right? Are people dressed in this class in one way or another to manage their identity, to manage their impression, to say to the world, here is who I am. I'm a college student and I'm dead broke and I dress like this, etc., etc. But will you go out for that job interview? Are you going to come in dressed like you are today? No, you're going to manage your impression, aren't you? You're going to say, see who I am? I'm a really spiffy guy. I'm a really nifty woman, and this is how I dress. I dress for success, don't we? What we say, when we say it, do we manage our identity? One time when I was in college, I was working on the maintenance crew with a bunch of other men, and that can be damaging. Men know that because now this current generation may not see this the way my generation did, because even women today use language that would make my dad shudder. But, you know, in those days there was a gender difference, but certainly a generational difference. So we've been working and going on all morning, and my mother shows up, and I use guy language in front of my mother. And then people afterwards said, do you talk that way in front of your mother? And I said, what did I say? Sometimes we don't even notice what we're saying, do we? The words that we use. Are we supposed to use the same words with grandmother that we use with our best friends? See, we manage our image, don't we? We manage our identity. Well, what else do we do in terms of intent? What else do we do? Do we entertain? Do we seek to entertain? Absolutely. Do we seek to be entertained? We seek to be entertained. Your generation is so willing to be entertained that you will steal, you will violate copyrights, won't you? Unless they are your copyrights, and then you're screaming mad. Don't steal music when it's my music, but steal anybody else's music because it's their music. It's a free-for-all out there. Do we adapt? Do we adapt? Is that one of our purposes, to adapt? Whatever. Sure enough. Okay by me. I don't really want to go along with it, but it isn't worth fighting over, right? I adapt. We talk in organizational communication about you being outside the organization, trying to get inside the organization. They call that an employee. You show up, and to what extent do you take the scripts on of the people within that organization? That's a sign of adaptation, isn't it? Sign of adaptation. I married a Southerner. People watched to see if I would eventually begin to talk like people from South Arkansas. Never did, I think. Although my relatives in Colorado say, think you did. I just use the word fixin'. Periodically, y'all, but other than that, I haven't paid my, you know. And identity becomes important too, doesn't it? Because sometimes we move among a variety of different groups, and the cost of being affiliated, do we communicate to affiliate? Is that one of our purposes, to affiliate? Sure. Could be acceptance. You see what I'm getting at? I'm just throwing out tons of words here because we often think that communication is limited to sending and receiving information. But we miss the point. It's so much more than that, isn't it? So much more than that. There's a guy by the name of McQuail, mention him in the chapter, who argues that there are 4 great reasons why we communicate. One of them is simply being. We communicate in a sense because we can. It is a part of who we are. We jump on this train, there's a narrative happening, we get in, we play a variety of roles, and then at some point we're done. That's the end of our play. We adapt, he said. He also brings in a term that sometimes really causes us concern. He says we communicate to control. Communicate to control. Do you like that notion or not? To communicate to control. To what extent might you watch the Weather Channel to control something? You can't control the weather, but can you try to control the influence the weather might have on what you do? Up in the country, in Carmine, Texas, the Lutheran Church was going to have outdoor services on Sunday. You think they were watching the weather report? They moved indoors. Control, to control our behavior. Do we try to control each other? Do we try to be controlled sometimes? Do we try to avoid control? Do we negotiate control? Do we negotiate control? My wife and I have been at this a long time, 38 years. Sometimes we even say that's unfair. That's an unfair fight. Can you do that? Can you say it's an unfair fight? Is it an unfair fight? Well, if the 2 people there decide that that's an unfair fight, then I guess it's an unfair fight, isn't it? Somebody said one of the reasons that marriage breaks up is that you can't communicate. Some of what we communicate is to define the rules of the relationship, don't we? What is fair, what is not fair? How do we deal with these problems? Because problems are going to come up. Is that what we're looking about in terms of purpose, intent? Do we often communicate without thinking about what our purpose is? We often do, don't we? So this whole notion that communication has to be highly purposeful behavior misses the point that sometimes communication can be highly unpurposeful behavior. And sometimes we even try to get the purpose of the behavior out because that helps us to understand what's going on. Why are you saying that? Why are you acting the way you did or the way you do? Does the purpose behind people's actions with us influence how we interpret what's going on, the meaning, and then determine what our response should be? Do you think? See, what we did earlier was to think that purpose was sort of a narrow little thing, and now we've realized that that concept is varied, situational, and one can argue, in some sense, the basis of meaning. Because I make interpretation of the message based upon what I think the person wants to accomplish by saying what they say at this particular time in that particular way. We do that with advertising all along, don't we? We know when it's an ad, and then we interpret it as an ad. Why do we do that? Because we know what ads are. You go in to buy a car, do you believe everything that the used car salesman or the new car salesman tells you? You filter it. You're trying to understand. We can also turn that around and say one of my reasons for communication is to be trusted, to be a trustworthy person. In a relationship, do I want to be trusted? We also know that sometimes these things are co-defined, aren't they? They're co-defined. Well, I know I can't trust her, but I can trust her not to be trustable. And therein lies the trust that I've got. I've got a good friend, and actually a daughter and a son-in-law, that if we want them to be somewhere at 2 o'clock, we tell them be there at 1 o'clock. That also gets into cultural issues, doesn't it? If you are in certain cultures, Latin America for instance, and you want dinner to occur at 7, what time do you tell them that dinner will be served? About 4? Our daughter and son-in-law spent some time in Spain and realized that nothing happens before 9 o'clock. Time. Now, one time, my wife and I invited some folks to our house for dinner, and they were from Holland. And we said, we'll eat about, we invite you to come at about 6 o'clock. And in the United States, you invite people 6 o'clock, you're going to eat at 7 o'clock. Here we are, and do you ever do this? When you invite people over, you're wandering around the house in your underwear. You're not ready yet, right? We look out there, they've driven up. Because in Holland, you get there early to help people do all of the work and get ready for the meal. Oh my gosh, we're in our underwear. Our guests are here. Purpose, you see? Purpose, 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 purpose. Okay, well, we also then come up with another one there, feedback. Feedback. Years ago, I used the metaphor or the illustration of feedback being a kid, boy or girl, playing basketball. Imagine standing at the free throw line, throwing the ball up. Our goal, purpose, is to put the ball through the hole up there called a hoop, drops down. That should be what we're trying to accomplish. The notion of feedback in a cybernetic model is that we throw the ball up, we see whether it goes through or not. If it went to the right, we say, well, then I have to try to get it to go more to the center. If it goes to the left, I have to try to get it to go more to the center. If it falls short, I have to throw it harder. If it hits the backboard and comes back, I have to throw it softer with less force. So we use feedback to determine whether we're being successful. Now, a lot of times we say to people, give me some feedback. But what we're really saying is, tell me something which I can use for feedback. Do you see the distinction that I'm trying to make there? Because the truth is, we often don't want what people tell us as feedback. Have you ever done that? You've written a poem, you've written a story, you've written a song, you've written a newspaper story, and you say, here, tell me what you think of this. Do you remember, you probably have never seen it, Chevy Chase, living out in the country, wanting to be a writer, funny farm, and he gives his wife the story to read, and then he's full of great anticipation, and she hates it. And he's so dying for her positive reaction. And you can imagine Chevy Chase, if you know he is. And he's getting fuller and fuller of this. And then when she tells him that it's awful, he ends up being a dead drunk. Well, that's why we had Chevy Chase playing it, right? And then in the midst of this, she becomes a successful author writing about a squirrel. And he, I think, is the squirrel in her story. And now he's really upset, see, because he's communicating something about his identity here, we think, and what he wanted was some response from her that could be used as feedback that he would say, yes, I am a wonderfully successful writer. So feedback is the reactions that we get from our communication effort that allow us to determine largely whether we're being successful in our communication plan, if we have a plan. Because sometimes if we don't have a plan, then we don't know when we're getting feedback. And do we ever deal with that in interpersonal communication when we say to somebody, listen to what I'm trying to tell you? I don't like you. What part of no don't you understand? Where we're trying to tell them something, but they're, in a sense, not getting it. We're trying to give them something that they should use as feedback that would then cause them to adjust their behavior. Our friend Robert on Cupid keeps getting feedback, and Robert somehow, in the minds of the two women on either side of Lisa, think he just doesn't get it. They called a massage creepy the other day, right? Did anyone see it on Tuesday night? Oh, you're missing the great dramatic event of the fall. So, feedback. Now we get into another message, right? Message. If I put out an ad, here's my message. My automobile roars along, it's wonderful, da-da-da-da-da-da. I've got a message, I have a message intended, don't I? My message intended is you should see this and lust for my automobile. Rush down immediately and buy one. Isn't that what my ad is supposed to accomplish? But you look at it and you might say, that's an automobile that I wouldn't be interested in. Wouldn't like that automobile. Don't like its style, meaning that sometimes you react negatively rather than positively. So was my message positive if you react negatively, or was it actually a negative message? Well, ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about messages is meaning. What is the meaning that is created when you get my message and interpret it? Is that the logic that we've talked about? What is the meaning that comes to your mind when you see something? When we talk about media effects, we see a lot of ads that have no meaning or relevance for us, right? We may know that something exists as a product, but we don't pay much attention. It doesn't influence us because it's irrelevant to who we are and what we might want as a way of sort of making sense of the world around us. So we have something that we can call a signal. We talked about that the other day. Something we call a symbol. A symbol is usually more general than a signal. Signal is more like a stop sign. A symbol is talking about stop signs. We have an intended message. We have a received message. And those two things may be quite different. We can think of message and meaning as stimuli. And then we can think of the decoding process of being the response. So we work through it in that particular kind of way. We have different thoughts about how meaning comes about. We're going to get into this in Chapter 3. How do we learn language? How do we learn language? The meaning in language. Isn't the meaning what we're really striving for? And isn't the purpose of language to create shared meaning so we have a sort of similar view of what goes on in the world? One of the theories of meaning that we'll talk about is referential meaning. And any of you that have been around children know that we sit with children and their storybooks and we say, that's a cow, that's a pig. Each of these different looking animals has a different name, right? And in a sense, that's the referential way of saying what meaning is. If I want to know the meaning of the word, one of the ways in which I can look at that is to see the thing that the word stands for. So that's one way to look at meaning. When we talk about meaning, though, we may turn that equation around and suggest that reality actually reflects the meaning in the words. Do you get what I'm saying there? I talked about cow, right? Is cow, does that meaning, is it the same for somebody that belongs to PETA as it belongs to one of these German farmers up in Fayette County? To PETA, that cow is not supposed to be eaten. I don't know what they think we're going to do with them, but we're not supposed to be eating them. There are some countries, New Zealand for instance, that's trying to pass animal rights as constitutions that says that animals' lives cannot be taken for food. So what's a cow? Cow is what we think a cow means, but the word cow can mean a lot of different things, can't it? Out in Fayette County, there's no ambiguity. That cow is just a hamburger waiting to happen. How we act toward the world around us is a reflection of our language and the culture that our language carries with it. Is that fair to say? Well, we're going to expand upon that. So meaning then begins to get more complicated, doesn't it? Now, can meaning be rule-based? If I say, I love you, what does that mean? Does it mean the same thing if we are a parent talking to a grandchild as it does two people looking at one another through alcohol-induced bleariness at 1:45 in the evening or morning or whatever 1:45 is. I love you. What does it mean? All of a sudden we begin to see how all of this stuff can become problematic, can become contextual, and we have to look at it with different, in a sense, theoretical and critical perspectives. Is meaning negotiated? Is part of our sense of what a friend is, the meaning of friend, is that negotiated between the two of us as friends? We define what friend is, so that when I say, you're my friend, I'm your friend, we know what that means. Does meaning obligate us? Does meaning obligate us? We can even argue that meaning is role dependent. Is that right? Meaning is role dependent. If we call somebody a police officer, what does that mean? What then do we think that person should do if they're a police officer? Oh, that gets more complicated, doesn't it? Now you begin to see layers of meaning and ambiguity and where we have to go. There's even a whole theoretical perspective called the critical theory people. We talked about this on the second day of lecture, that try to deconstruct the meaning of a society looking for power and control. Elites, they had words like hegemony and so forth. Critical theory? The critical theory people look for the influence in society, the power in society. To what extent do the people that get to define the meaning of the society have more power than the people who are therefore controlled by that meaning? And do we use meaning to control society? Sure do. I think it's also interesting, isn't it? We have a president that shows up and says, we've brought you democracy. Anyone want to write in one sentence what democracy means, so that if somebody in Iraq said, hey, do we have it yet? You could tell them yes or no because you know what democracy is. Isn't that an amazing term? What enormous ambiguity there is to democracy. And we know that democracy doesn't allow us to do just anything we want to. There is an enormous amount of obligation and responsibility with democracy, isn't there? Okay, let's say we've communicated for a while. To what extent is the meaning of our relationship based upon what we've just done? What we talked about, how we talked about it, why we talked about it, what we said, what we didn't say, is that then meaning of who we are, what we are? Well, see, this is why we begin to get more complicated, and we'll see that as we get into the next chapter. Now let's talk about channel. Channel's really fun, isn't it? It's really easy. People will often define channel as a technology. Print's a technology, isn't it? Electronic is a technology. So one of the ways we talk about mediated or mass-mediated communication is to focus on the nature of channel as a technology. We get interested in the web. What's interesting about the web is the nature of that channel, right? But then we get to our old friend Berlow. Berlow argued that a channel of communication is any of the senses that we use as a part of the communication experience. What do I mean by that? If I meet you and for the first time we shake hands, to what extent is the handshake communicative? To what extent is the handshake communicative? Can you tell people's character by their handshake? We often think we can. Are they a firm person or are they a wishy-washy person? We used to work hard to tell women, when you go in for your job interview, if you have the chance to shake hands, and sometimes men wouldn't extend their hand to a woman because men didn't know how to shake hands with a woman. Because men and women never shook hands, right? Then you have to have a firm handshake, yeah.
Isn't that kind of misleading, though, the way you shake hands? Because, like, I've shaken hands with guys that, like, I mean, they're really, really strong, but it just kind of shows, like, insecurity, too, if you overdo it, don't you think? So then it's kind of misleading.
You're suggesting then that there are layers of meaning, levels of interpretation, just at the point of handshake? How complex can communication be? But you're right. See, we make sense of all of this. This is why I'm beating on all of these terms and maybe trying to confuse you, because maybe out of confusion comes more clarity. But the notion is, yes, you're absolutely right. We can make all kinds of misjudgments. Misjudgments in terms of the intensity of the eye contact as well, right? One time I was in a seminar watching people teach people who were going to teach Navajo children out at the University of New Mexico. These were Anglo types going to teach Navajo children. One of the things that was impressed upon them is that if you ask Navajo children who took whatever it is that's missing in the room, they'll all look guilty. One of the greatest violations in the culture of the Navajo is for children to look into the eyes of an adult. And we work on the assumption that you look into people's eyes if you're telling the truth, you look away if you're lying. They all look guilty to me. But it's confusing, isn't it? It's a misjudgment. It may be culturally based. Uh-oh. Culture begins to haunt its way back into this model, right? So we can talk about technologies as channels, but we can also talk about any of the stimuli. If I say I like you, and touch your arm with my hand, is that different? If I say I like you and I give you a big warm hug, all of those kinds of things may be a different channel, because it's a different sensory perception that I'm using as a part of the communication process. How people smell, not how their nostrils work, but the odors that they give off, is that communicative?
Not intentional.
Maybe not, but we'll take it into consideration, right? But we'll take it into consideration. We even manipulate it by going down to the local store and standing there until we get just the right fragrance, so that we now are really ready for that date. This is how we smell all the time, right? This is who we are. We want just the right fragrance out there. So Berlow argued that any of the ways in which we experience the world can become a part of the communication process. If you're in the restaurant and you serve delicious food, is that communication? Right. That's communication, isn't it? We often have multiple channels going on at the same time. Print, we often say, is one channel. Radio, we say, is one channel. Television is two channels, isn't it? Because we've got two sensory perceptors going on, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So, channel is useful to us. We have to be careful. Channel also builds into some other themes like networks. Networks. Within an organization, we have networks. If I want to get information, how do I get information in an organization? We certainly don't wait until the people at the top of the organization tell us what's going on, do we? We have our own ways. We have the grapevine. In an organization, my wife used to be a professional secretary. How powerful in an organization is the secretary? Enormously powerful. Because the secretary knows everything. When we were in the University of New Mexico, she worked for a company that was contracted to be a part of the deep testing of radioactive materials out in Nevada. Now, I'm sure that some of you know what a Selectric typewriter is, and others of you have no idea, so I'll describe it. A Selectric typewriter used to have a carbon ribbon cartridge in it, and that carbon ribbon fed across an element that clicked and clattered in a way that put impressions on paper. That was a Selectric typewriter. So that at the end of the day, if you wanted to know everything that the secretary had typed that day, which could be top secret documents, all you had to do was to take that cartridge and spend time going back through it So that at the end of every day's work, here came a military officer and an officer of the company. They took the cartridge out of the typewriter and they put it into the bag to be shredded that night. All of the top secrets were on that cartridge. But then you see, I worried that my wife would be held hostage and that the Russians would interrogate her. Tell us about all of that. Because she knew about all of that, didn't she? But we often think those are the people that don't know anything. They're just the secretary. Well, in an organization, do you try to find out how the organization communicates? And we know that usually the formal form of communication is not the most accurate or the most up-to-date or the most truthful, so we figure out how to find out what's going on. Networks. So we begin to build channels as networks. We talk about networks of news gathering, networks of news dissemination, etc., etc. Now, we come to something that's kind of interesting. We'll talk later on about a guy by the name of Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan became very famous in the 60s. McLuhan argued that the medium is the message. Oh my gosh. The medium is the message. Is television a different message than print? His argument is that print is very linear. You encounter each word at a time, and it's low in sensory stimulation. Now, that may or may not be the case. Some of us know, if we've got a good imagination, that television never gets the story nearly as interesting as what our imagination had it to be. You know what I'm talking about? So some of you that are readers don't necessarily go to the movie imagining that the movie will be nearly as good as the movie that played in your head when you read the book. He argued that television was multimedia, in a sense, multidimensional and multi-stimuli. Because what we do is we take little dots of information and we compose them into an ongoing sequence of visual stimuli coupled with audible stimuli. Television. One of the arguments that grew out of this was that he said that the 60s was a clash between the linear print society, parents, and the television multilinear society, the students. He accounted for the whole war effort based upon two kinds of individuals because of the media that they had been attentive to primarily during their lifetime. Well, that's a pretty interesting story. He also argued that the light bulb was the purest form of information. I think he'd had too many shots of something that day. But nevertheless, you see, these were the sorts of things that McLuhan talked about. The medium is the message. Now, what's interesting also is when we see this, he created what was, along with his friend Innes, a theory called communication determinism. And their argument was that each new medium that comes along dominates until a newer media comes along to dominate. So we have print, then we have radio, then we have film, then we have television. Now we've got the internet. The internet gives us more command, doesn't it? We can have music, we can even compose our own DVDs, we can do all of this, which also takes us back to the notion of sender and receiver. We can now talk about these people as users, that we use the media in various kinds of ways. Oh my gosh, it's getting complicated. Okay, context. At the macro level, context is culture. Is that a fair statement to make? Context is culture. Culture is context. Do we, for instance, communicate differently in the United States than we might find people communicating in other countries? Not only by language, but also by convention. By convention. So, we also even have different views of the world competing by culture or by context. And sometimes these are sort of subcultures, aren't they? If you go to a doctor's office, are you now in a subculture? You've got new languages. The doctor can talk to you in things and terms and so forth that you may not even know about. And you just say, well, whatever. You know, tell me what, how regularly. If I can afford it, I'll do it. If I can remember it, I'll take it. Whatever it might be. Well, let's talk about doctors' offices. Are people honest in the doctor's office? If the doctor asks you for information, do you tell the doctor the truth? More if you're a woman than if you're a man. Is that right? Women are willing to say, well, these are all of my symptoms, and the guy is willing to say, you got a degree? You figure it out. Are we willing to lie to a doctor? You bet. Because if we think that telling the truth will get us scolded or medicated, we may lie. Or we may lie to get medicated. Oh, so we thought this was where truth was. Distortion, purpose, right? Misinformation, disinformation. I had a rather serious medical problem summer before last, if we're out of this current summer, 2002. They asked me what I had been doing before this occurred, and they asked my wife, and they found out that I was lying to them because I didn't want them to know what was really going on. Because I knew they'd tell me, well, don't do that anymore, and I didn't want anybody to tell me that, right? Sort of like my grandmother. She had a stroke at 82. She goes to the doctor. The doctor says, quit hoeing in your garden at a woman your age. She said, I'm a woman of my age, and I can darn well take care of myself, and I'm a heck of a lot older than you, and the doctor telling her was actually 6 months older. So there are two 82-year-old people arguing about how they're going to live. Neither one of them going to be changed. They know good and well, but they feel some responsibility to do all of this sort of thing, right? So, context. A romantic context, a liking context. You go out with somebody on a blind date. You meet somebody. You say, I think I like this person. You go to contexts in one way or another to communicate. We go into the living room. We turn on the television set. We go to the concert. And then we behave in various ways based upon what it is that we're trying to get out of that particular context. Context can be circumstance. In our life, certain things change, and the changes in our life can become a context. I finally fought to get a book contract broken because the relationship between I and a co-author and between me and the co-author and the publisher just was ruinous. We were not working along very well. Well, context, circumstances change, don't they? Relationship is context. Purpose is context. I go to be entertained. I go to a concert. I listen to the symphony, and I ask myself, is this communication? Are they communicating with me? Am I getting from this what I wanted? All of these kinds of things. Context dictates rules. If I go to a rock concert, are the rules of communication differently than if I go to the Houston Symphony? Am I supposed to periodically at the Houston Symphony stand up and, do whatever? And if I go to some rock concert, am I supposed to sit there sedately and doze off? See? Lecture. Here you are. This is context. In my office, different context. One of the things I found interesting over the years is to find students outside of the university. Now the context differs, particularly if they're somehow in charge of what my life is. I had a good friend student who was a captain over at Morton's. We got a good deal going over there, right? He's got more power over me over there, but we've negotiated a working relationship. He might add just a little bit of steak to my steak, go back and pick out the better steak. See what I'm getting at? The context can influence how we want to adapt to the context, how we want to, if you want to use the word, manipulate the context. And the context may influence how we communicate. Cognitive processes are the last of these. There's a guy by the name of Fisher that talks a lot about us not realizing that people are either enormously thoughtful or thoughtless in the communication process. And it differs, doesn't it? We also talk about communication planning. How clever are we at communication planning? I'm involved with the Public Relations Student Society of America. One of the things we tell people is to get writing samples so that when you go out on a job interview, you can have your writing samples. One of my students came in the other day and she said, I got a job because nobody else had their writing samples. So the point we're getting at is, to what extent are we thoughtfully putting together a plan that will be successful in this communication situation, or we just sort of show up and say mindlessly? Are we going to prepare for job interviews? If we see that a relationship is beginning to change, do we become more thoughtful about the way in which we communicate? One of the studies that we will talk about later on in the semester was for a faculty member to ask students like you to keep a diary on the relationships that developed, changed, matured, and deteriorated during the semester. Can you tell when a relationship is beginning to get better? Can you tell when a relationship is beginning to deteriorate? Length of time between the last letter or email or phone call, length of the letter, duration of the phone conversation, all of that sort of stuff. I love you, down at the bottom of your letter. Finally comes to, with my regards. You begin to say, I think something's changing here. We are thoughtful to the extent that the communication process at that particular moment is more or less important to us. Mindful, memory and recall. When we get into the chapter on media, we'll talk about how people learn to process mediated messages. How people learn to process mediated messages. A lot of us, we don't think about that, right? We talked a little bit about episodic memory. If you're watching Tony Soprano today and you've never seen him before, you have no idea what kind of a guy this is. Just one of your local neighbors, kind of a friendly guy, easy to get along with, always a comment. Is that who Tony really is, you see? Or is Tony a little bit more forceful in the way in which he deals with friends and not so friends? We've seen Tony do some pretty dramatic things in the time that he's been Mr. Soprano, right? So you have to have episodic memory. To what extent do we interpret? To what extent do we interpret things differently? We were talking earlier about older and younger people. Younger people often don't like classical music. They like music that sounds a whole lot like people have no idea what they're doing and they're doing it together loudly. And then somehow as people get older, they may like other kind of music. They may lose their taste in music. And then I like the notion of out where I am, those are the Aggie kids out there. They all want to listen to country western, find out who's got the biggest pickup and the deadest dog. And you city kids think their music is stupid. You pay no attention to it unless it's Willie, and everybody loves Willie. So the notion is our memory, our recall, our ways of interpreting. Does it sound good? Does it sound bad? We remember in varying ways conversations, relationship moments, turning points, all of these sorts of things. And that becomes a part of where we are today. Mindfulness. How about perspective taking? What do we mean when we talk about perspective taking? Being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. Do we communicate with people by trying to see ourselves from their point of view? Are women more likely to communicate by trying to understand themselves from a man's point of view, and men being fundamentally indifferent? You're shaking your head no? What do you think?
I think they say they do, but they don't.
Oh, they're pulling tricks on us again, right? They're cleverer than we are. Perspective taking. Being able to see the world from other people's points of view can help us to understand how we communicate or how we miscommunicate with people. Should bosses be good perspective takers? We often find that bosses that are good at perspective taking turn out to be more useful to solving the problems of the employees and less willing to just tell employees what to do. There is an ad now for Warner Television. Have you seen the ad? where the boss runs around with a coffee pot giving everybody coffee, gives one woman a back rub and all of this. Now there's a perspective-taking boss. He's there to help make his workers work better because they're working for you. Whether you believe the ad or not, it's a good example. I ought to get that, put that one up on the web. Our knowledge, what we know. Knowledge is both what we know by some book that we've read, right? But knowledge is also what we know by our life's experiences. Sometimes we can't communicate with people across generations because people on different sides of those generations have experienced different sorts of stuff. I don't know how many of you have known people that lived through the Depression. It changed people. It really, really changed people. One of my interesting stories, at least in my mind, is as a boy in western Colorado, I went down into a hillside on our piece of property, and at the bottom of it, I found a bunch of bones. And I thought that the Navajos or the Utes had driven buffalo or something over the cliff. We've seen all of this in the movies, haven't we? And that they were bones down there. And I went rushing up to the house, and I told my parents that I discovered this as if they'd never seen it before. And they told me that during the Depression, they took cattle and pigs that they could not feed. They didn't have the food, couldn't sell them to anybody. Nobody had money. Took them down there, shot them. People that have experienced that are different, aren't they? Not having money. Having too much money, having too much, too little, all of these kinds of things, knowledge and experience. Well, what I've tried to do today is to sort of open your eyes to the complexities of what we're trying to account for, suggesting why, among other things, that it was entirely too limiting when the early models tend to talk about the communication process of being sending and receiving, where we thought that a channel was nothing but a transmission technology. And so as we then launch our way into the chapter on language, message, and meaning, we maybe are a little bit more open to sort of let some of this theory wash onto us and inform us, because we see in various ways the ways in which individuals have worked to develop theories to try to solve the question, answer the question, how does communication work? Also in chapter 3, which we'll take up on Tuesday, we get to our first theories as theories. So particularly those of you that are looking for theories that you can use for your paper in here, we'll begin to lay them out in full detail and see how they compete against one another as an explanation of phenomena. Any questions before we conclude, wrap up for the day? Then we'll see you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.